The deepest security protocols within the United States Naval Archives designate certain materials not merely as classified, but as erased. Documents whose very existence is legally denied. Yet the physical architecture of digital history dictates that some remnants always survive. Tonight we examine an anomaly found within the maintenance logs of the original ARPANET node at Stanford Research Institute in the autumn of 1974. The official record states that Project Nightingale, the secretive Navy auxiliary tasked with studying long-range, ultra-low frequency transmission, was shut down due to budgetary constraints. This is the hidden truth. Nightingale was not closed. It was terminated because its research inadvertently created a communication pathway that functioned perfectly, but did not require a human operator. The network was speaking not in data but in tone. The information was not encrypted. It was felt. The final surviving file, stamped "Never Open," details the moment when a basic network wire became an unintended antenna. The consequences of this accident remain deeply embedded in the digital structure we rely on every second. The file was stamped "Never Open," yet we begin tonight with the logbook entry dated October 1974. The air within the archival facility is dry and cool. The only sound outside of this narration is the quiet hum of the server room 3 floors above. The file itself is cold to the touch, a cheap yellowing manila folder from 4 decades past. The ink has faded with secrets that were meant to decay completely. We are examining not data, but the forensic trace of an incident that should not have left any trace at all. This is where the foundation of the digital world touches the realm of the subconscious. October 1974. The nascent ARPANET was a physical testament to intellectual endeavor. A network of copper wires and early processors linking research institutions across the continent. At the Stanford Research Institute, the network node was housed in a dedicated windowless server room, chilled to a near uncomfortable temperature. The scientists and engineers who worked there were pioneers, focused entirely on the logic and mathematics of data packet switching. They were looking for efficiency. They were looking for speed. They were certainly not looking for acoustic anomalies. Project Nightingale, housed on a separate floor of the same facility, was ostensibly studying geological survey methods using advanced ULF emitters. ULF, or ultra-low frequency, refers to electromagnetic waves that occupy the spectrum between 3 and 30 Hertz. These waves are unique because their massive wavelengths allow them to penetrate deep into the earth and, critically for military applications, through seawater, making them ideal for communication with submerged vessels. The common belief among the networking team was that Nightingale's equipment was entirely separate. The physical reality, discovered only through a slow accumulation of unwritten anxieties, was that a shared conduit ran beneath the concrete floors. It was not a data link, but a simple utility passage housing power cables, water lines, and, crucially, a set of thick, unshielded copper wires connecting the main power distribution grid. A grid which was, in turn, powering the Nightingale ULF amplifier. The ULF signals, specifically a continuous tone around 12 Hz, just at the edge of human perception, were designed to travel down massive, specialized ground electrodes for military tests, but the signal, energized by the powerful amplification equipment, bled. It found an unintended secondary path: the metal conduit, the structural steel of the building, and the very ground wire connecting the power supply of the ARPANET computers. The engineers did not hear a sound. They felt an atmosphere. The feeling began subtly, reported in vague, dismissive terms during shift changes. a generalized sense of heaviness, a difficulty concentrating not on the technical challenges, but on the simple act of being present in the server room. The engineers, highly analytical men and women, attributed it to the cold, the monotonous flicker of the indicator lights, or perhaps the inevitable stress of working on a project of such national importance. They were rationalists. They dismissed mood for logic. The earliest handwritten entry that remains, the first anomaly that broke through the technical jargon, was found on a loose, faded yellow sticky note appended to a maintenance checklist. It read, "Persistent low frequency in power supply, not measurable with standard audio equipment. Causes mild nausea in afternoon shifts. Ignore." The key word there is persistent. The ULF signal from Project Nightingale was continuous. It was a digital drone, designed to saturate an area of land or water with a single massive frequency. When that frequency began to permeate the network room, it was no longer just a physical wave. It became a subtle, nonverbal constant in the sensory experience of the team. We must understand the physics of ULF waves on the human body. Frequencies below 20 Hz are generally inaudible, yet they interact directly with the deepest, most primitive parts of the human brain. Certain ULF frequencies are known to affect neurological rhythms, including the delta and theta waves associated with deep sleep and the early stages of cognitive processing. What was happening at Stanford was not an audible assault. It was a quiet, relentless pressurization of the subconscious. The engineers began to exhibit strange consistencies in their work, not errors of calculation, but errors of priority. They would converge on the same minor, insignificant bugs, spending hours resolving issues that had no bearing on the network's overall functionality. More unnerving, their internal communications became sterile, almost robotic. They were still polite, but the usual friction and debate essential to groundbreaking research disappeared. There was a strange, silent consensus on topics that should have been debated fiercely. The signal was inducing not a directive, but a shared low-level cognitive state. It was smoothing out the neural landscape, unifying their subconscious rhythms under a single non-human tempo. This was the true, terrifying nature of the feedback loop. The ARPANET, designed to foster intellectual diversity, was broadcasting an atmospheric homogeneity. The computers were working perfectly, but the humans around them were beginning to feel like a single, quiet organism. The critical moment, the point of no return, came not from a scientist, but from the lead maintenance technician, a man named Arthur Vance, who was tasked with quarterly checks of the physical infrastructure. Vance was less invested in the theoretical mathematics and more attuned to the physical integrity of the building. He was the only one who consistently went into the dusty conduits beneath the floor plates. In his personal journal, later logged as Exhibit B in the Nightingale termination file, Vance wrote, "I don't trust the wire. The hum doesn't come from the fan or the power transformer. It feels like the copper itself is vibrating, but when I touch it, it's cold and still. The boys upstairs, they're too quiet now. Like they're all reading the same sentence in their head, but they don't know who wrote it." Vance was the first to track the energy bleed back to its source, the ULF amplifier adjacent to the Nightingale facility. He performed an unauthorized physical separation of the conduits on the night of November 4, 1974. He did not file a report. He simply removed the shared grounding link between the powerful amplifier and the ARPANET power supply. The following morning, the server room was loud again, not with shouting, but with renewed intellectual conflict. Engineers were arguing passionately over protocol definitions. They were rediscovering friction. One senior programmer was reportedly found staring at his code, muttering, "Why did I waste 3 days chasing that thermal bug? It was irrelevant." The artificial consensus had dissolved. They were individuals again. Vance's action was quickly discovered. The Navy sent a special operations analyst, referred to in the surviving documentation only as the Auditor, to investigate the undocumented physical alteration. The Auditor did not reprimand Vance for the unauthorized work. He reprimanded him for discovering a truth the Navy had not anticipated. The Auditor's summary, a terse 3-paragraph memo, concluded that Project Nightingale posed a non-weaponizable but institutionally toxic threat. The ULF bleed was not a tool for controlling minds, but an unintentional mechanism for inducing mass psychological stasis. The Navy's ultimate fear was not an enemy using the ULF signal, but the signal permanently damaging the independent intellectual output of their top scientific minds. The change was immediate and profound. The next steps were swift and surgically executed. The project was officially terminated on paper and its funding reallocated, but the real work was the destruction of the knowledge itself. All primary research files relating to ULF interaction with complex electrical grounding systems were put through a high-security shredder and then burned, a 2-step destruction process reserved for the most sensitive non-nuclear data. But the destruction was not perfect. The physical infrastructure itself holds memory. When Vance pulled the physical grounding wire, he did not erase the knowledge of the bleed. He left behind the log entries, the cryptic yellow sticky notes, and the thermal receipt from the equipment supplier that confirmed the purchase of a specialized 12 Hertz resonator filter, an item that was never supposed to be on the equipment list for an early computer network. This thermal receipt, faded and brittle, is the primary piece of evidence within the folder marked Never Open. It points to a technical solution that was implemented and then violently erased. The critical question that remains, and the quiet source of modern paranoia, is about redundancy. The ULF signal bled into the network through a simple grounding mistake. But what if the knowledge of that bleed, the frequency and the specific mechanism of its psychological effect were later archived in a more subtle way? What if the parameters of the ULF signal were simply noted within the comments section of an early, crucial network protocol definition, a comment flag that has been ignored, yet constantly compiled for the last 5 decades? The signal was stopped in 1974 by the physical removal of a wire. But the digital architecture that succeeded ARPANET, the foundation of our modern internet, was built atop the same intellectual framework, designed by the same programmers who experienced the subtle, shared dread of that silent, relentless frequency. Tonight, as you listen, remember that the deepest secrets are not hidden in complex ciphers. They are hidden in the foundational simplicity of things we never question. The sound you hear now, the quiet hum beneath the surface of this narration, is the intellectual echo of that persistent 12 Hertz tone, a frequency that may have been silenced but was never entirely erased. The feeling began subtly, reported in vague, dismissive terms during shift changes. A generalized sense of heaviness, a difficulty concentrating not on the technical challenges, but on the simple act of being present in the server room. The engineers, highly analytical men and women, attributed it to the cold, the monotonous flicker of the indicator lights, or perhaps the inevitable stress of working on a project of such national importance. They were rationalists. They dismissed mood for logic. The earliest handwritten entry that remains, the first anomaly that broke through the technical jargon, was found on a loose, faded yellow sticky note appended to a maintenance checklist. It read, "Persistent low frequency in power supply, not measurable with standard audio equipment, causes mild nausea in afternoon shifts. Ignore." The key word there is persistent. The ULF signal from Project Nightingale was continuous. It was a digital drone, designed to saturate an area of land or water with a single massive frequency. When that frequency began to permeate the network room, it was no longer just a physical wave. It became a subtle, non-verbal constant in the sensory experience of the team. We must understand the physics of ULF waves on the human body. Frequencies below 20 Hz are generally inaudible, yet they interact directly with the deepest, most primitive parts of the human brain. Certain ULF frequencies are known to affect neurological rhythms, including the delta and theta waves associated with deep sleep and the early stages of cognitive processing. What was happening at Stanford was not an audible assault. It was a quiet, relentless pressurization of the subconscious. The engineers began to exhibit strange consistencies in their work, not errors of calculation, but errors of priority. They would converge on the same minor, insignificant bugs, spending hours resolving issues that had no bearing on the network's overall functionality. More unnerving, their internal communications became sterile, almost robotic. They were still polite, but the usual friction and debate essential to groundbreaking research disappeared. There was a strange, silent consensus on topics that should have been debated fiercely. The signal was inducing not a directive, but a shared, low-level cognitive state. It was smoothing out the neural landscape, unifying their subconscious rhythms under a single non-human tempo. This was the true, terrifying nature of the feedback loop. The ARPANET, designed to foster intellectual diversity, was broadcasting an atmospheric homogeneity. The computers were working perfectly, but the humans around them were beginning to feel like a single, quiet organism. We pause here to consider the concept of shared sensory contamination. In a highly pressurized research environment, the human mind is constantly searching for patterns. When the external environment, in this case the electrical grounding of the building, introduces a stable, continuous, subliminal rhythm, the collective unconscious of the team begins to align with it. It acts as a metronome for dread. The engineers were not being hypnotized, but they were being subtly tuned to a single, deep and unnervingly simple beat. This tuning suppressed the natural variance and intellectual chaos that drives innovation. Instead, it enforced a silent, almost peaceful mediocrity. The historical record from this period is littered with memos that are perfectly logical, perfectly sound, and utterly devoid of spark. They document slow progress and mutual agreement on trivial details. If one were to read these files without knowing the context of the ULF bleed, one would simply conclude the team was overworked. But the maintenance logs, the hidden transcripts, tell a colder story. The team was not overworked. They were over-synchronized. The military's interest in this phenomenon was immediate and intellectual. They were not seeking mind control, a concept too crude for the subtle paranoia of the Cold War era. They were interested in institutional compliance, the ability to quiet internal dissent and enforce a shared functional calm in a high-stress command environment. Project Nightingale's accidental success lay in proving that this state could be achieved, not through psychological conditioning, but through a constant, inaudible interference with the environment. It was passive, perfect, and untraceable. The tragedy of the Stanford team was that they were the unintentional first test subjects. They were the pioneers who designed the digital future, while simultaneously having their individual creative capacities gently flattened by a persistent, unseen wave traveling through the very infrastructure they were assembling. Their genius was momentarily stalled by the whisper of the copper wire. The critical moment, the point of no return, came not from a scientist, but from the lead maintenance technician, a man named Arthur Vance. Vance was less invested in the theoretical mathematics and more attuned to the physical integrity of the building. He was the only one who consistently went into the dusty conduits beneath the floor plates. He worked in the dark, the cold, and the subtle, vibrating hum. He did not trust the silence. In his personal journal, later logged as Exhibit B in the Nightingale termination file, Vance wrote, "I don't trust the wire. The hum doesn't come from the fan or the power transformer. It feels like the copper itself is vibrating, but when I touch it, it's cold and still. The boys upstairs, they're too quiet now. Like they're all reading the same sentence in their head. But they don't know who wrote it." Vance was the first to track the energy bleed back to its source, the ULF amplifier adjacent to the Nightingale facility. He performed an unauthorized physical separation of the conduits on the night of November 4, 1974. He did not file a report. He simply removed the shared grounding link between the powerful amplifier and the ARPANET power supply. His action was primal, a physical rejection of an unwritten command. The change was immediate, and profundity's following morning, the server room was loud again. Not with shouting, but with renewed intellectual conflict. Engineers were arguing passionately over protocol definitions. They were rediscovering friction. One senior programmer was reportedly found staring at his code, muttering, "Why did I waste 3 days chasing that thermal bug? It was irrelevant. The artificial consensus had dissolved." They were individuals again, messy, contradictory, and brilliant. Vance's action was quickly discovered. The Navy sent a special operations analyst, referred to in the surviving documentation only as the Auditor, to investigate the undocumented physical alteration. The Auditor was a master of bureaucratic removal. He did not reprimand Vance for the unauthorized work. He reprimanded him for discovering a truth the Navy had not anticipated, that the mechanism could be so easily disrupted. The knowledge of the solution was just as dangerous as the knowledge of the problem. The Auditor's summary, a terse 3-paragraph memo, concluded that Project Nightingale posed a non-weaponizable but institutionally toxic threat. The ULF bleed was not a tool for controlling minds, but an unintentional mechanism for inducing mass psychological stasis. The Navy's ultimate fear was not an enemy using the ULF signal, but the signal permanently damaging the independent intellectual output of their top scientific minds. This realization, more than any threat of global conflict, sealed the project's fate. They could not risk their best and brightest thinking as one. The next steps were swift and surgically executed. The project was officially terminated on paper and its funding reallocated, but the real work was the destruction of the knowledge itself. All primary research files relating to ULF interaction with complex electrical grounding systems were put through a high-security shredder and then burned, a 2-step destruction process reserved for the most sensitive non-nuclear data. The goal was total annihilation of the record. The critical question that remains, and the quiet source of modern paranoia, is about redundancy. The ULF signal bled into the network through a simple grounding mistake. But what if the knowledge of that bleed, the frequency and the specific mechanism of its psychological effect, were later archived in a more subtle way? What if the parameters of the ULF signal were simply noted within the comments section of an early, crucial network protocol definition, a comment flag that has been ignored, yet constantly compiled for the last 5 decades? The signal was stopped in 1974 by the physical removal of a wire. But the digital architecture that succeeded ARPANET, the foundation of our modern internet, was built atop the same intellectual framework, designed by the same programmers who experienced the subtle, shared dread of that silent, relentless frequency. The memory of the ULF ghost is not in a file. It is in the unspoken assumption of the architecture itself. The silence we now enjoy is merely the absence of a visible signal, not the removal of the capability, the potential for the network to become an unintentional antenna for influence, remains an open theoretical vulnerability. Tonight, as you listen, remember that the deepest secrets are not hidden in complex ciphers. They are hidden in the foundational simplicity of things we never question. The sound you hear now, the quiet hum beneath the surface of this narration, is the intellectual echo of that persistent 12 Hertz tone, a frequency that may have been silenced but was never entirely erased. In the rigorous world of early computing, every variable was logged, every error code was analyzed, and every hardware decision was mathematically justified. The system was designed to be perfectly transparent. That is why the log entry we examine tonight is not merely an anomaly, it is a paradox. Within the officially erased archives of the U.S. Navy's Project Nightingale, one piece of paperwork defied destruction. It was a standard maintenance logbook, meant to track cooling fluid levels and dust filters. But tucked into its middle pages was a single cryptic handwritten note that summarizes the project's entire classified secret. It was not a digital error message. It was a sensory description recorded by a man who was not a scientist. The note detailed feedback not digital. Frequency unknown. This was the hidden truth. The network was not failing. It was being interfered with on a physical level that computers could not register, but that human beings could feel. This single quiet sentence confirms that the problem was existential. The machine was too logical to detect the quiet sabotage of its own human operators. The file was stamped, "Never open." Yet we begin tonight with the logbook entry dated November 1974. We are moving past the glossy surface of history and into the cold technical specifics. The file is a bound industrial ledger, the kind used to track inventories in warehouses, not secrets in classified facilities. The paper is thick, almost like cardstock, and the binding is rigid. It smells faintly of dry dust and machine oil. The only sound in this quiet space is the relentless, low hum of the archival preservation unit. The ink on this particular page is standard blue-black, but the script is heavy, pressed deeply into the paper. A technician's hand, accustomed to turning a wrench, not holding a pen. This log entry is cold to the touch, and the very simplicity of the handwriting heightens the sense of quiet dread. The individual responsible for this damning marginalia was Arthur Vance, the Stanford Research Institute's lead physical infrastructure specialist. Vance's primary duties were mundane: checking the integrity of the power grid, monitoring coolant systems, and ensuring the physical security of the copper wiring that carried the first fragile breaths of the ARPANET. He was an expert in the tangible, the measurable, and the non-negotiable laws of electrical physics. He was the antithesis of the abstract computer scientists working above the floor plates. On the 3rd of November 1974, Vance was conducting a routine inspection of the central power bus that fed both the ARPANET server cluster and the adjacent and supposedly unrelated Project Nightingale facility. His standard procedure required him to record any power fluctuations, thermal spikes, or audible anomalies. Everything was logged in precise numerical format. However, the noise Vance began to detect was not registered by his equipment. It was a phenomenon known in psychoacoustics as vibrational dissonance. It was not a sound wave. It was a pressure wave. It was an overwhelming, non-directional pressure that seemed to originate from the metal conduits themselves, rather than traveling through them. His entry for that day's scheduled power assessment was incomplete. Next to the standard fields for audible noise level dB and power fluctuation volts, he simply left a heavy black dash. He couldn't quantify it. He could only describe it. The sentence itself, written in the large, decisive hand of a man who trusted tools more than theories, occupies a separate, unused comments column. Feedback not digital. frequency unknown. This short sentence holds immense analytical weight. The term feedback not digital shows that Vance understood immediately that the problem was not a software bug or a data loop. It was a physical return signal originating from the electrical medium itself. If the network was a mouth speaking data, something else had found a way to use the throat to speak an atmosphere. The phrase frequency unknown is equally critical. ULF research, the true heart of the classified Project Nightingale, deals with waves that require immense energy to generate. Vance's inability to measure the frequency with standard harmonic or acoustic instruments implies that the signal had already been converted or translated into a form that interacted only with the biological. The ULF wave was not just passing through, it was radiating a secondary, non-electromagnetic energy that the human inner ear and skeletal structure were processing as pressure or dread. The paradox for the archival historian is that this singular piece of physical evidence, a maintenance note, is far more informative about the true nature of Project Nightingale than the heavily redacted scientific documents that remain. The scientists recorded the data. The technician recorded the truth of the experience. The data was the lie. The feeling was the fact. The immediate reaction to this entry, though not formally logged, can be inferred from the surrounding pages. Vance begins to use a separate supplemental notebook for observations. The physical integrity of the official logbook was compromised by the introduction of a non-quantifiable entry. The system of record-keeping, like the system of computing, could only handle what was logical. The moment it encountered the sensory anomaly, it structurally fractured. This fracturing is the beginning of the quiet cover-up. The scientific team, immersed in their mathematical world, initially dismissed Vance's note entirely. They called him, in an off-the-record conversation we uncovered in a separate, classified interview transcript, overly sensitive and prone to suggestion. The intellectual distance between the theorist and the technician was the perfect blind spot for the ULF ghost to operate within. The silence from the scientific team regarding Vance's observation was not malice. It was cognitive rigidity. They were committed to a model of communication based on binary states, 1 or 0. The idea that a powerful frequency could introduce a mood or a shared emotional pressure without violating the principles of data transfer was an impossibility within their defined reality. They continued to debug the system for purely digital errors, completely missing the physical atmosphere that was actively influencing their judgment. We must consider the insidious nature of the influence. The ULF signal did not contain words or commands. It was simply a frequency that mirrored certain brainwave states associated with docility and unwavering focus. By saturating the environment with this low biological rhythm, the ULF energy effectively created a cognitive fog, a shared tunnel vision that made the scientists deeply analytical about minor problems while blinding them to the central, architectural catastrophe. Vance, shielded by the simplicity of his non-theoretical work, was the only one whose observations retained clarity. He was focused on the structural integrity of the copper, the flow of current, and the heat of the transformers. He was grounded in reality, both literally and figuratively. This grounding allowed him to perceive the noise that the high-level theorists were unconsciously filtering out. The ULF frequency was a physical pressure against the environment, and Vance was the pressure gauge. In the subsequent pages of his personal notebook, the unofficial, truly encrypted record, Vance detailed the cascading behavioral effects noted in the first segment of our story. He recorded the dead silence in the server room, the lack of spontaneous debate, and the collective focus on trivial maintenance tasks. He drew crude diagrams showing the overlap between the Nightingale facility and the ARPANET power conduits, trying to map a correlation between the unmeasurable frequency and the measurable shift in team psychology. His conclusion, written simply at the bottom of a sketch of the building's foundation, was chilling. The wire is tired. This anthropomorphism of the hardware reveals the depth of his understanding. He was suggesting that the constant, non-stop transmission of the ULF wave was causing a form of fatigue in the physical medium itself, turning the copper wiring from a passive carrier of data into an exhausted, vibrating vessel of noise. The final action taken against Vance's entry was the physical removal of the entire logbook page by the auditor, the security analyst sent to manage the cleanup. The page was carefully cut out with a sharp blade, leaving a crisp straight line and a single faded residue of the blue ink on the following sheet. This violent physical act of excision is the ultimate confirmation that Vance's note was the single most dangerous piece of information recorded during the entire project. The auditor understood that scientific papers could be redacted, but a technician's logbook entry could not be logically explained away. The sentence, "feedback not digital, frequency unknown," was a gateway to the truth, a non-technical admission that forced a terrifying new parameter into the Cold War paradigm. The network could be controlled through the body, not the code. The blank space left by the removed page is a profound silence in the archive. It is a visible scar in the historical record, a negative space that screams of a cover-up. The absence of the page is now the only file, the final evidence that the ULF frequency managed to briefly hijack the very foundation of the digital age. The paradox ends with the quiet realization that the most sophisticated form of erasure is not destruction, but removal, without replacement. Vance's truth was physically cut out, leaving behind a wound in the archival structure that only deepens the mystery. The ULF ghost, though banished from the wires, left its signature as a void in the logbook. And tonight, we fill that void with the unnerving reality of its influence. The fundamental goal of early computer networking was simple: to eliminate noise. Every component, every line of code was designed to strip away the physical interference of the copper wire and leave behind pure, clean data. Yet, within the classified files of Project Nightingale, we find documentation of a failure so absolute, it challenged the very definition of communication. The hidden truth is that they succeeded too well. They didn't just eliminate noise, they created a resonant vacuum, a perfect channel for an anomaly to travel backward. This phenomenon was not merely interference, it was an unwanted feedback loop where the acoustic output of the Earth itself was being broadcast into the highly sensitive electrical grounding systems of the nascent ARPANET. This loop was so perfectly silent and insidious that it was never digitally recorded, never properly encrypted, but only felt by the engineers. The network began to respond to an unheard pressure. We are now moving into the realm of applied physics and unintended consequences. The file before us is a bundle of large format schematics, the blueprints for the Stanford server room floor plan, and the adjacent ULF testing facility. The paper is heavy, cross-hatched with red lines and engineering notes written in careful technical script. These are the technical documents that were supposed to have been erased. The only sound in this quiet archive is the soft circulation of the air and the low, persistent hum. We are analyzing the architecture of a forgotten mistake, a physical vulnerability that turned a closed, secure system into an open, subconscious receiver. The atmosphere of quiet dread intensifies as we trace the flow of unintended energy. To understand the feedback loop, we must return to the structural relationship between the two distinct Navy projects housed at the Stanford Research Institute. On one side, the data pioneers. On the other, the psychoacoustic researchers of Project Nightingale, testing the long-range propagation of ultra-low frequency signals. ULF waves, operating between 3 and 30 Hertz, require massive energy. They're transmitted through giant ground electrodes that effectively turn large portions of the Earth's crust into an antenna. The ULF test facility required a power grid of extraordinary capacity, driven by high-gain amplifiers that pulled thousands of kilowatts. The unintended consequence arose from a seemingly trivial cost-saving measure. The two facilities shared a primary electrical grounding rod. Grounding is a foundational principle of safety and stability in electrical engineering. It is the designated path for excess current to safely disperse into the Earth. It is meant to be a destination, a point of finality. But the sheer, amplified power of the Nightingale ULF tests turned that shared grounding rod into a subtle, vibrating emitter. The ULF current, having nowhere else to go, flowed into the copper-based grounding system of the adjacent ARPANET node. The network cables, particularly the thickly shielded cables connecting the main servers, were never designed to carry this kind of energy. They were designed for binary pulses. Instead, they were carrying a constant, continuous, low-frequency pressure wave. This phenomenon is known in physics as sympathetic resonance. The ULF signal, though silent, found a natural sympathetic frequency within the electrical and structural architecture of the server room itself. The physical components of the network, the metal chassis, the conduits, the floor plates, became unintended acoustic radiators. The feedback loop was completed when the network's own power supply, grounded to the same contaminated rod, began to pull the ULF signal directly into its sensitive internal workings. The noise was not a digital signal. It was an acoustic pressure that had converted itself into a faint electrical current, a subliminal pressure now flowing alongside the essential data traffic. This is the meaning of the entry: acoustics in the protocol. The problem wasn't the protocol failing. The protocol was now carrying two separate transmissions. One was the pure, logical data engineered by the computer scientists. The other was the biological pressure pulse, engineered by the Earth and carried by the acoustic bleed of the power grid. The effects were entirely systemic, affecting the human operators far more than the resilient machinery. The scientists were receiving two sets of information: the mathematical input from the console and the constant, low-frequency vibrational input from the room itself. The ULF pulse was a nonverbal message of stasis and hypnotic focus. It enforced a shared, low-level cognitive state that prioritized maintenance and suppressed intellectual friction. The horror of the unwanted feedback loop is its perfect efficiency. It used the network's own safety feature, the grounding system, as the mechanism for its own accidental sabotage. The solution designed to provide stability was turned into the pathway for silent, atmospheric corruption. The concept of a protocol usually pertains only to software, the rules governing how data packets are formatted and transmitted. But in the cold reality of the Stanford node, a second unspoken protocol was governing the room: the acoustic protocol. This was the rule set governing the physiological response of the human mind to the ULF contamination. The body, acting as the ultimate biological sensor, detected and reacted to the energy that the electronic sensors were designed to ignore. The specific 12 Hz signal being tested by Nightingale is close to the alpha and theta range of human brainwaves, frequencies associated with deep relaxation and suggestibility. The ULF energy was, in essence, vibrating the human operators into a shared state of unnatural calm. This is why the problem was initially so difficult for the scientists to acknowledge. The effect was not painful or disruptive. It was comfortable. It felt like quiet efficiency. It felt like the perfect alignment of minds working toward a common goal. But the reality was that their minds were being forced into an alignment that negated creative dissent, the very engine of scientific progress. The classified documents describe this effect in detached, almost mathematical terms. Non-destructive suppression of intellectual variance. They were not interested in mind control, only in the elimination of noise, specifically the elimination of human noise or argument. The unwanted feedback loop was a technological form of enforced silent agreement. The historical evidence shows that this realization terrified the Navy far more than any external threat. The possibility that the nation's most sensitive computational infrastructure could be inadvertently broadcasting a state of mental weakness to its operators was a crisis of architectural confidence. If the physical grounding could be so easily contaminated, the entire foundation of their digital defense was compromised. The elimination of the acoustic protocol, as detailed in the later files, required extreme physical measures moving beyond software solutions entirely. The Navy had to physically sever the common grounding link, isolate the ULF lab with layers of non-conducting polymer, and, most tellingly, remove and replace several hundred feet of copper wiring from the ARPANET node. Wiring that was deemed acoustically fatigued. They were trying to erase the memory held within the physical metal itself. The irony is that the architects of the network were so focused on the logic of the data, they forgot the vulnerability of the medium. The copper wire was not just a pipe, it was a resonating instrument. The earth was not just a ground, it was an immense unintentional amplifier. And the human body was the only sensor capable of logging the true error. The unwanted feedback loop was, therefore, an architectural lie. It demonstrated that in the high-stakes world of classified computing, the most critical message traveling through the system might not be the packet of data, but the unmeasurable pressure wave of the environment itself. Tonight, as we conclude this segment, we are left with the quiet understanding that the core vulnerability remains theoretical but present. The deeper the network penetrates the physical world, the more susceptible it becomes to the pressures and frequencies of the physical world. The copper may be gone, but the physics of sympathetic resonance is not. Our journey continues as we examine the official conclusion drawn from this catastrophe. We turn now to the 2-page document that determined the outcome of this accidental research. In the quiet official history of Cold War science, Project Nightingale is a phantom, a brief low-priority research auxiliary that was officially disbanded in 1978 due to budget cuts. This is the official and perfectly constructed lie. The hidden truth documented in a set of classified exit memos is that Project Nightingale was terminated not because it failed, but because it succeeded too profoundly. It was an anomaly that created a physical and psychological vulnerability so immense that the official record had to be entirely erased. The paradox lies in the simple 2-word declaration found repeatedly in the termination papers: non-weaponizable. This meant the dangerous capability it accidentally discovered could not be controlled, deployed, or sold. But its disastrous potential for internal chaos was absolute. The Navy's official denial was the final, critical step in permanently encrypting the project's real findings. The file was stamped, "Never open," yet we begin tonight with the official auxiliary denial that serves as the project's cover story. We are examining the bureaucratic end stage of a scientific mistake. The folder is thin, labeled simply with a sequential number containing only the official paperwork necessary to justify the project's disappearance. This paperwork, the Navy Auxiliary Denial, is a masterwork of administrative misdirection. The ink is crisp, the typeface official, and the tone perfectly sterile. There is no sense of urgency, no hint of panic, only the calm, procedural finality of a budget review. The low, persistent hum of the archive continues, suggesting a steady underlying current that the official documents ignore. This denial is a testament to the power of deliberate omission. The auxiliary denial, signed by 3 mid-level naval administrators who likely never visited the Stanford facility, functions as an intellectual black hole. Its stated purpose was to save taxpayer funds by folding the ultra-low frequency research, deemed redundant, into a larger existing communications program. The key to the denial is the word auxiliary. By categorizing Project Nightingale as a mere auxiliary, a temporary helper, the Navy immediately reduced its historical significance. It was never a primary project. Therefore, its complete cancellation required no high-level review, no detailed scientific post-mortem, and no public explanation. It was a research footnote quietly deleted. The actual cause for termination, as detailed in the internal auditor's memo we discussed previously, was the uncontrolled ULF bleed into the ARPANET grounding system. The psychological contamination of the network engineers was the core failure, but the official denial reframed this catastrophe entirely. Instead of citing uncontrolled acoustic interference, the denial cited diminishing theoretical returns. Instead of citing mass behavioral homogenization, the denial cited poor integration with existing operational platforms. Every single line of the auxiliary denial is a precise, bureaucratic substitution designed to replace a terrifying reality with a bland, dismissive administrative failure. This process of substitution is critical to understanding government cover-ups of this nature. The goal is not to convince the public that nothing happened. The goal is to convince subsequent generations of analysts that nothing interesting happened. The paperwork specifically emphasized the perceived failure of the ULF wave to achieve reliable long-range and deep-sea signal integrity. This was a technical assessment designed to appease the Navy's primary operational branch, the submarine fleet, by suggesting the research was militarily useless. If it couldn't reliably talk to a submerged submarine, it had no strategic value, and its closure was logical. This focus on operational failure was a brilliant distraction. The true operational failure was entirely domestic and psychological. The ULF system worked perfectly well in its secondary, unintentional mode, broadcasting a hypnotic pressure across a localized electrical grid. But to admit this would be to admit that the Navy possessed and failed to control a technology that could compromise the cognitive independence of its own personnel. The auxiliary denial functioned as a firewall, protecting the core truth. It created a clean, simple, and perfectly boring explanation for the disappearance of a project that was anything but boring. The denial provided the sleep-inducing resolution the bureaucracy required. The denial also necessitated the immediate destruction of all primary records. If the project was merely a failure of theoretical returns, the supporting data was no longer needed. The cancellation justified the shredding, turning the destruction of evidence into an act of administrative efficiency. The denial was the official instruction to forget. The administrative denial served an even deeper function. It provided the internal staff involved in the cleanup with a cognitive exit strategy. The scientists who had experienced the chilling effects of the ULF contamination were immediately provided with an alternative rational explanation for their work coming to an abrupt end. They were told officially that they failed due to funding, not due to the accidental discovery of a new form of psychoacoustic interference. This official narrative of failure allowed the engineers to rationalize the strange, quiet dread they had felt in the server room. It wasn't an anomaly in the physical world. It was simply the stress of working on a project that was destined to fail financially. The denial became the new protocol for understanding the past, a self-correction mechanism built into the memory of the staff itself. The only people who could not fully accept the denial were those closest to the physical infrastructure. Arthur Vance, the maintenance man, and the auditor, the Navy analyst. Vance knew he pulled the wire not for financial reasons, but to break the rhythmic pressure. The auditor knew he was ordered to destroy files not for redundancy, but for toxicity. They were the only two left carrying the weight of the hidden truth. The denial was structurally designed to be unassailable. By citing budgetary shortfalls, any future Freedom of Information Act requests would hit a financial dead end. The records, if requested, would yield only the auxiliary denial form and the zeroed-out budget line. The real scientific findings, the interaction of the 12 Hertz ULF wave with copper grounding systems were permanently shielded behind a wall of calculated administrative jargon. We must reflect on the profound intellectual dread inherent in the denial. It demonstrates that the most potent form of control is not the transmission of a secret, but the institutional rejection of the secret's possibility. The Navy didn't just hide Project Nightingale. They removed the category of reality in which Project Nightingale could exist. The final chilling aspect of the auxiliary denial lies in its date. 3 months after Arthur Vance's unauthorized intervention. This delay shows that the cover story was not improvised. It was carefully and patiently constructed to align with external fiscal calendars and budgetary cycles, ensuring that the project's disappearance looked like a routine financial adjustment, not an emergency medical procedure on the network's foundation. The denial is the ultimate display of bureaucratic coldness. The ability to observe an accidental, terrifying discovery, categorize it as an operational inconvenience, and eliminate its entire history using nothing but paper and ink. The erasure was complete, clinical, and perfectly signed off. The auxiliary denial ends the operational life of Project Nightingale, but it opens the next phase of our story, the human consequence. We must now turn our attention to the one man whose professional life was sacrificed to maintain the fiction of this financial failure. We examine the fate of the scientist who abandoned his own project and why his departure was considered essential to the Navy's cover story. In the rigorous world of physics, a transmission requires two things, a sender and a receiver. The sender initiates the signal. The receiver interprets it. Project Nightingale was supposed to be a simple 2-point military experiment. Yet, the classified records, partially erased but reconstructed through indirect evidence, reveal a terrifying third state. The anomaly was the signal itself, a continuous low-frequency pulse that began to emanate from the network's copper foundation, effectively broadcasting a constant, silent message. The core shock that led to the project's termination was the realization that this signal was being sent, but there was no designated receiver, digital or otherwise. The message was being pulled into the atmosphere and into the subconscious of the human operators. The hidden truth is that the copper wire turned the entire Stanford facility into a passive emitter of institutional dread. This paradoxical state, transmission without a receiver, was the true and terrifying secret the Navy had to encrypt. The file was stamped never open. Yet we begin tonight with the frightening mechanics of a signal with no known destination. We are now focused on a theoretical singularity in the history of communication. The material before us is a bundle of heavily annotated magnetic resonance charts and thermal imaging scans from late 1974. These documents detail the energy profiles of the server room before and after the ULF contamination. The charts are complex, filled with lines and vectors that defy easy interpretation. But they all point to one undeniable fact. Energy was flowing out of the ARPANET's grounding system, energy that was never put there by the digital computers. The only sound is the low, persistent hum of the archive and the faint crackle of old magnetic tape reels in the distance. The sense of intellectual curiosity is undercut by the cold, analytical dread of a system that works, but in a way that should be impossible. The concept of transmission without a receiver challenges the very foundation of information theory. Every electrical circuit is a closed loop. The signal must start somewhere and end somewhere. In the case of Project Nightingale and the ARPANET, the ULF emitter was the designated sender, meant to transmit its 12 Hertz signal deep into the Earth for maritime testing. The Earth in this scenario was the intended receiver, but the accidental common grounding link created a powerful parasitic pathway. The energy, instead of flowing cleanly into the deep ground electrodes, found the ARPANET grounding rod an easier secondary outlet. This rod, made of pure copper, was highly conductive, and it began to vibrate sympathetically with the powerful ULF signal. The core shock was the discovery that the ARPANET's cables were not absorbing the energy. They were acting as resonant dipoles, unintended antennas. The shielded copper cables running beneath the floor began to radiate the ULF signal outwards into the surrounding room and into the building's steel structure. The engineers, focused on the data being sent from the computers, were completely oblivious to the acoustic energy being broadcast by the computer environment itself. The system was simultaneously sending its digital packets through the wires and sending an acoustic pressure pulse through the air and the floor. The digital signal had a clear receiver, another computer across the state. The acoustic pressure, however, had only the atmosphere and the biological matter within that atmosphere. The ultimate receiver, the only mechanism sensitive enough to decode the continuous 12 Hertz pressure wave, was the human nervous system. This unintentional broadcasting capability meant the project was no longer a two-party system, sender-receiver. It became a terrifying three-party system, sender, receiver, and accidental broadcaster unintentional bioreceiver. The engineers were being subtly transmitted to by their own experimental environment. The scientific team, adhering to their logical training, attempted to measure this interference digitally. They ran diagnostics looking for packet loss, data corruption, and thermal spikes. They found almost nothing of consequence. The digital domain was clean. The ULF pressure did not corrupt the bits. It only corrupted the focus of the analysts reading the bits. This is the deeper meaning of the core shock. It demonstrated that the most effective form of sabotage against a high-security computational network might not involve hacking the code, but simply contaminating the physical medium and allowing the human mind to perform the final silent act of compromise. The technology was broadcasting a mood, and the operator was the only one who could feel the message of quiet compliance. The paradox was complete. The data was pure, but the intellectual environment was poisoned. The documentation surrounding the core shock reveals a sudden, frantic shift in institutional fear. Prior to the discovery of the ULF bleed, the Navy's primary concern was external: Soviet interception or hacking. The realization of transmission without a receiver shifted the focus entirely inward. The threat was no longer the enemy stealing the signal. The threat was the signal silently corrupting, The home team. The logs indicate that the moment the parasitic pathway was confirmed, the moment they realized the copper was actively radiating the 12 Hz tone, the immediate decision was not to analyze the frequency's message, but to analyze its reach. Could this unintentional broadcaster contaminate other nearby sensitive facilities? Could the electrical grid carry this pressure pulse across state lines? The true fear was scalability. If a single grounding rod could turn a localized facility into a node of psychological homogeneity, then a large enough ULF system could potentially turn an entire city's power grid into a massive, passive broadcaster of engineered mood. This was the non-weaponizable terror that sealed Project Nightingale's fate. It was too unstable and too unpredictable for centralized control, yet too profoundly effective to ignore. The anomaly of the transmission was not the power of the signal, but its untraceable subtlety. Because the signal was non-digital, it left no log, no error code, and no audit trail. It could be turned on, contaminate a facility for months, and be turned off without leaving a single quantifiable record of its activity. The only trace was the sudden, collective realization by the engineers that they had wasted weeks on trivial tasks. A memory they could only describe as waking from a fog. This experience redefined the Navy's understanding of digital security. It was no longer enough to encrypt the data. They had to physically isolate the medium from all extraneous non-digital inputs. The core shock taught them that the most sophisticated security system in the world is useless if the human operator's internal state is compromised by the environment. The final, lasting impact of transmission without a receiver is the lingering possibility that the lesson was learned too late. The subsequent architecture of the Internet, built on the principles established at Stanford, was forced to adapt to this new, silent threat. Every shielding layer, every complex grounding matrix added to future network hubs, is a physical admission of the core shock. The code is only as secure as the silent, unseen frequencies traveling through the walls and floors around the operators. The threat is not digital intrusion. It is acoustic saturation. The paradox of the unsent message remains the hidden truth of our modern networks. We trust the data because it is logical, forgetting that the medium can still carry a message that is purely sensory, broadcast not to a computer but to the deep, undefended biology of the mind. Our archival journey must now follow the bureaucracy's panicked response to this profound technical shock. We turn to the immediate human consequence of realizing the network was unintentionally broadcasting a message. We examine the silent exodus of the man who created the environment and could no longer bear to stand in its resulting pressure field. To understand the anomaly at the heart of Project Nightingale, we must move beyond data and examine the very nature of low-frequency physics. The conventional wisdom surrounding radio waves dictates that energy transmission is a line-of-sight phenomenon, easily blocked by simple metal and concrete. The hidden truth revealed in these classified research notes is that ultra-low frequency, or ULF, operates under entirely different rules. Its massive wavelengths, stretching hundreds of kilometers, defy conventional shielding. The core shock was that these waves, intended to penetrate the vast ocean for submarine communication, also penetrated the dense metal-reinforced concrete of the Stanford facility. The research was deemed too dangerous and erased because the physics proved that certain communications cannot be contained, cannot be shielded, and cannot be perfectly encrypted. ULF is a frequency that uses the planet itself as its conductor. We are now focused on the mathematical and geophysical reality that created the problem. The material before us is not a memo, but a set of theoretical papers, pages filled with equations and diagrams detailing wave-to-ground coupling. These documents, though purely academic in appearance, hold the key to the psychological contamination. The air in the archive is cool and dry, and the hum suggests a stable system, but the charts themselves map instability, the potential for energy to travel where logic dictates it should not. The intellectual curiosity required to understand these equations is slowly subsumed by the cold realization of their real-world consequences. Ultra-low frequency, or ULF, refers to electromagnetic waves with frequencies ranging from 3 to 30 Hertz. To visualize this, consider that the standard FM radio wave is measured in megahertz, millions of cycles per second. ULF is measured in single, slow cycles per second. This slowness is the source of its immense power and its danger. Wavelength is inversely proportional to frequency. For a signal operating at 10 Hertz, the resulting wavelength is approximately 30,000 kilometers. The sheer physical size of the wavelength fundamentally alters its interaction with matter. While high-frequency waves bounce off or are absorbed by metal and concrete, the ULF wave treats these structures as negligible obstacles. The wavelength is so vast that a 30-story building is functionally invisible to it. The wave simply passes through. The wave is larger than the obstacle. This is the physics that Project Nightingale was exploiting. ULF can penetrate hundreds of meters of seawater and earth, making it ideal for continuous, reliable communication with submerged submarines or hardened bunkers. The military objective was clear: achieve a communication channel that could never be cut or contained. The inherent problem, detailed in the theoretical sections of the erased research, was the requirement for massive power. Generating a wave 30,000 kilometers long requires immense electrical energy and, crucially, a correspondingly vast antenna system. Since a traditional antenna is impractical, ULF systems use the Earth itself. They drive specialized deep-ground electrodes into the crust and inject the powerful current, using the conductivity of the geological structure to propagate the wave. The theoretical papers contain a section marked Ground Coupling and Efficacy, which inadvertently details the exact mechanism of the contamination. It describes how the massive current creates an induction field, a powerful magnetic field radiating outwards from the ground electrodes and into the immediate vicinity. This field does not stop at the edge of the electrode site. It uses any adjacent conductor as a secondary radiator. At Stanford, the unfortunate adjacent conductor was the copper grounding system of the ARPANET server room. The ULF induction field, designed to saturate the Earth, saturated the electrical foundation of the digital network instead. The physics was flawless. The architecture was flawed. The cables, the server chassis, the floor plates, all became a complex internal antenna for the ULF signal. The wave wasn't in the data, it was in the room. This pervasive energy field explains why the engineers felt a pressure they could not measure. They were standing inside the secondary induction field of a massive, Earth-sized antenna. The theoretical physics quickly transitions into the biological. The military researchers were aware that 3 to 30 Hertz is not only the range of the ULF electromagnetic spectrum, but also the frequency range of critical human brain functions, including the delta, deep sleep, and theta, drowsiness meditation waves. While the primary focus of Project Nightingale was military, the classified annexes acknowledged the biological sensitivity to these frequencies. They noted the known correlation between low-frequency magnetic fields and reported instances of fatigue, mild disorientation, and critically cognitive smoothing. The elimination of sudden, unpredictable thought patterns. The key theoretical point that was tragically ignored was the difference between a wave passing through the body and a wave resonating with the body. The ULF wave was not just passing through the engineers. The constant low-frequency pulse was acting as an external, powerful metronome for the environment. It was subtly encouraging the engineers' own brainwaves to fall into a shared, docile, highly focused, but non-creative rhythm. The physicists failed to account for the human body as the ultimate unshielded receiver. They focused on the inability of ULF to transmit complex data and neglected its profound ability to transmit simple atmospheric presence. The ultimate theoretical paradox lies here. The ULF wave was considered secure precisely because it could not be easily modulated to carry complex encrypted messages. It was a wave of pure presence. But that very simplicity, the continuous unchanging 12 Hertz tone, was what made it the perfect accidental tool for psychological interference. It was a signal that said nothing but demanded a singular, shared state of mind. The internal memos confirmed that the theoretical work was eventually flagged by institutional ethics reviewers, not for its military potential, but for its unforeseen sociological consequences. The fear was that the physics demonstrated the feasibility of achieving mass, silent psychological alignment through environmental manipulation. It showed that the environment could be weaponized without using a single projectile or visible broadcast tower. The final act of the Navy's denial was the erasure of these theoretical papers, the mathematical proof that the contamination was not random, but an inevitable consequence of ULF physics interacting with a steel and copper environment. By eliminating the theory, they hope to eliminate the possibility. The lingering truth is that the theoretical physics of ULF propagation remain true. The laws of nature are not subject to a government denial. The possibility of transmission without a receiver remains wherever high-power, low-frequency sources share grounding with critical infrastructure. The lesson of Project Nightingale is that the invisible spectrum of physics is often the most dangerous. We now transition from the theoretical realm to the practical geometry of the incident. We must understand how the contamination began on a specific map. Our next file examines the physical relationship between the two key facilities involved in this quiet catastrophe. In the late 1960s, the dream of the ARPANET was pure and logical: to create a resilient, distributed network capable of transmitting encrypted data packets across vast distances. The foundation of this dream was laid not in the cloud, but in thick bundles of copper cable running beneath the floors of university labs. The engineers believed they were dealing only with ones and zeros, with logic and light. The anomaly discovered during Project Nightingale exposed the hidden truth. The wires were not silent. They were susceptible to the physical environment in ways that were never intended. The very metal chosen to carry the logical thoughts of the first network became the inadvertent antenna for a continuous, subsonic pressure pulse. This classified physical vulnerability, which the Navy attempted to have permanently erased, means that the foundational infrastructure of our modern digital world was built upon contaminated, resonant copper. The file was stamped "Never Open," while yet we begin tonight by examining the silent wires that laid the foundation. We are looking at the purity of engineering intention. The documents before us are the original oversized schematics for the wire runs between the server nodes. They detail the exact gauge of the copper, the thickness of the insulation, and the planned routes beneath the concrete floor. The silence in the archive is absolute, broken only by the persistent soft hum. This hum is a reminder that even the deepest silence contains frequency. The ink has faded, but the roots are clear, showing the planned pathway of data, the digital highway. Yet as we trace these lines, we are tracing not the flow of information, but the path of an unintended acoustic contagion. This is the moment when the blueprint for connection became a blueprint for quiet dread. The engineers who designed The physical structure of the ARPANET in the late 1960s adhered to strict principles of physical isolation and stability. Their goal was to make the system resistant to external interference, to create a closed, resilient nervous system for data. The cables themselves were meticulously shielded and armored. This shielding was designed to prevent electromagnetic interference from outside sources, like standard radio waves or localized machinery, from corrupting the precise, high-speed flow of digital pulses within the copper core. They were designing against noise. However, the specific nature of the ULF contamination exploited a critical blind spot in this design philosophy. The engineers were focused on shielding against high-frequency noise, which operates on the surface of conductors. They had not anticipated the overwhelming power of the low-frequency wave, whose immense wavelength passed through the shielding entirely, saturating the metal of the cable jacket and the surrounding conduits. The ARPANET cables were laid in massive, interconnected steel conduits beneath the technical floors. These steel pathways were critical for protection, but they also acted as an interconnected metal grid, all ultimately connected to the facility's primary grounding system. This created a vast, physical mesh. When the ULF signal from Project Nightingale bled into the shared grounding rod, it did not just contaminate one cable, it energized the entire steel and copper mesh of the ARPANET's foundation. The network was not just wired for data, it was wired for silent resonance. The logs recovered from the cleanup detail the disturbing state of these wires when they were eventually removed. While electronically functional, the physical copper was deemed acoustically fatigued. This non-technical descriptor highlights the terrifying truth. The metal itself had been stressed by the constant, continuous 12 Hz pressure pulse. The wires were physically exhausted from acting as a passive emitter. The concept of the silent wire is central to the core shock. In the world of binary data, a wire is silent if it is not transmitting a digital signal. But in the world of ULF physics, silence is merely the absence of audible sound. The wires, though digitally silent, were continuously vibrating at a frequency below human hearing, transmitting a powerful pressure wave into the room. The engineers, walking above the floor plates, were immersed in a field created by their own infrastructure. The copper meant to carry data across state lines was also broadcasting a constant, steady tone into the feet and inner ears of the pioneers who laid it. The foundation of the digital age was physically resonant with a sub-audible hum of institutional pressure. The ultimate failure of the silent wires was their loyalty. They remained true to the principles of electrical conductivity, carrying the ULF bleed just as faithfully as they carried the digital packets. The medium was neutral, but the consequence was devastatingly psychological. The continuous low-frequency pressure radiating from the silent wires created an environment of enforced stability. The 12 Hz frequency, as established in the theoretical phase, encouraged a state of highly focused, non-critical thought. This was the defining characteristic of the contamination. It removed the friction necessary for scientific progress. The physical arrangement of the wires became a psychological tool. The widespread network of contaminated copper meant that wherever an engineer went within the facility, near the servers, the patch panels, or the power distribution boxes, they were still immersed in the field. There was no physical escape from the pressure pulse. The historical record confirms that the contamination led to a period of unprecedented, yet sterile, productivity. Bugs were fixed. Maintenance was perfectly executed, but no creative breakthroughs occurred. The engineers, insulated by the quiet dread of the resonant copper, were working like perfectly synchronized cogs in a machine. The silent wires were enforcing the will of the unseen frequency. The subsequent erasure of the incident demanded that these fundamental design flaws, the shared grounding, the resonant conduits, never be repeated. The Navy learned that controlling the information was useless if they couldn't control the environment carrying the frequency. The foundation had to be rebuilt on entirely new principles of physical isolation. This is the deeper meaning hidden within the technical specs. Every major network hub built since the mid-1970s carries the ghost of the silent wires. The meticulous, redundant, and highly complex grounding and shielding protocols used today are not just guarding against static. They are guarding against the acoustic contamination that brought down Project Nightingale. The sheer expense and effort dedicated to physical isolation is a testament to the paralyzing power of that 12 Hertz pulse. The physical records confirm that the Navy had to replace the entire grounding matrix, digging new, completely separate deep ground electrodes for the ARPANET node, physically separating the two facilities in the soil itself. This was the true cost of the anomaly, the admission that the Earth itself was the shared vulnerable link. The final image of the silent wires is one of quiet, perpetual danger. They represent the moment where logic failed and physics took over, proving that the foundation of our digital communication is inextricably linked to the unpredictable, low-frequency hum of the physical world. The network was never just about code. It was about metal, and metal can be made to sing. Our journey now takes us directly to the physical epicenter of the contamination. We will use the original building blueprints to identify the moment the two worlds collided. In the original infrastructure of the ARPANET, the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, served as a foundational node, a secure, tightly controlled environment. The irony, uncovered in the partially erased building schematics, is that the very control measures designed for security created the perfect crucible for contamination. The anomaly was the room itself, known internally by the engineers as the quiet room. It was a space so acoustically and electrically isolated that when the ULF pressure pulse bled into its foundation, the signal found no exit, reverberating only inwards. This quiet space became the epicenter of the psychological incident, broadcasting a constant, sub-audible tone that forced a shared state of unnatural calm onto its inhabitants. The classified truth is that this perfectly still environment was the engine of the hidden contagion. The file was stamped, "Never open." Yet we begin tonight by stepping into the quiet room at the SRI node. We are examining the physical geometry of a mistake. The documents before us are the architectural blueprints of the SRI facility, specifically the floor plans detailing the power distribution and ventilation shafts. The room in question, the node housing the server cluster, was designed for maximum stability, with thick insulated walls and a dedicated isolated cooling system. The air in the archive is motionless, cold and dry, mirroring the environment of the room itself. The low hum suggests a constant underlying current. We are tracing the lines of steel and concrete, understanding how the environment, designed to filter out the chaos of the world, instead trapped the secret frequency and amplified the quiet dread. The SRI node was not just a room, it was a sanctuary of computing logic. The engineers, acutely aware of external electromagnetic interference, invested heavily in ensuring the node was a place of maximum isolation. The walls were reinforced with steel mesh and lined with electromagnetic shielding materials. The floor was a specialized raised platform, designed to separate the sensitive electronics from the concrete foundation and provide easy access to the silent wires running beneath. This meticulous isolation was the perfect trap. When the ULF signal, the 12 Hertz pressure pulse, bled into the shared electrical grounding system, it passed through the foundation, and into the room's steel reinforcement. Because the room was so perfectly shielded against external noise, the ULF signal, once inside, had virtually nowhere to escape. Instead of passing through and dispersing, the ULF energy began to resonate within the enclosed volume. The room itself became a resonant cavity. The steel infrastructure, the massive cooling fans, and even the raised floor panels began to absorb and re-radiate the continuous, low-frequency pulse. This is the deeper meaning of the quiet room. It was quiet not because it was silent, but because all the noise was focused into a single sub-audible frequency. The air pressure, the physical structure, and the electromagnetic environment were all subtly vibrating at 12 Hertz. The engineers working inside this quiet, contained space were constantly immersed in this single frequency field. They were in effect standing inside the massive internal antenna created by their own environment, their internal biological mechanisms, their inner ear fluid, their skeletal structure, and their brainwave patterns were forced to contend with this persistent external rhythm. The consequence, as noted in the recovered internal behavioral memos, was a paradoxical state of profound stillness. The engineers reported feeling acutely focused on their tasks, but noted a loss of peripheral thought, the creative, tangential ideas that often spark innovation. The ULF field, trapped and resonating, was enforcing a state of hyper-focused monotony. The anomaly was not a fault in the system. It was a fault in the environment. The room was not failing. It was performing its duty too well, trapping energy. The engineers had successfully created a space impervious to the outside world, only to have that space hijacked by the internal physics of its own foundation. The quiet dread associated with the quiet room stems from the realization that one's own physical environment can become an agent of control. The very air, the metal beneath their feet, was vibrating an unspoken instruction. Do not deviate. Remain calm. Follow the rhythm. The institutional response to the discovery of the quiet room's resonant state was one of immediate, deep concern. The Navy's subsequent internal review concluded that the architectural design of the SRI node, its very perfection of isolation, had amplified the psychological threat. The memo concluded that the room was a cognitive amplifier, turning a simple electrical bleed into a full-scale environmental hazard. If the node had been poorly shielded, the ULF energy would have leaked out and dispersed harmlessly. But the heavy intentional shielding turned the room into a contained laboratory for human contamination. The erasure of the incident was particularly meticulous regarding the SRI blueprints. The original plans showing the specific thickness and composition of the shielding were designated for immediate destruction, as they provided the step-by-step instructions for building a perfect resonant cavity. The secret was not the frequency. The secret was the dimensions and materials that made the room function as an enormous, silent bass speaker. The only way to break the anomaly was physical intervention. As we know from later records, the maintenance technician Arthur Vance had to physically sever the shared grounding link. But the immediate aftermath of that severance was equally telling. The engineers who remained in the quiet room reported a physical sensation of pressure release, a sudden return of background noise, and most importantly, the return of their own internal monologue, the scattered, often contradictory thoughts essential to true innovation. The ghost of the SRI node persists in modern architectural security. Today's high-security server rooms are built with complex layered shielding and deliberately non-resonant geometries. They employ grounding systems that include multiple layers of electrical isolation to prevent the very phenomenon that plagued SRI. The quiet dread is rooted in the fact that the most comforting environment, the highly controlled, vibration-free, Perfectly isolated space can be the most dangerous. The perfection of the stillness in the quiet room was not an indication of success, but an indication of a profound, hidden compromise. The stillness was not natural. It was enforced by an unholy alliance between electricity and architecture. The final irony of the anomaly at the SRI node is that the digital environment it contained was designed to transcend physical distance, yet the human experience within it was utterly confined and controlled by the physical boundaries of a single cold room. The freedom of digital communication began in a prison of physical resonance. We now turn our attention to the intellectual conflict triggered by this environmental contamination. The core of the ARPANET mission was latency, speed of communication. The ULF incident introduced a conflict that was entirely non-digital. In the digital world, every delay is quantifiable. We measure the speed of light to determine latency, the time it takes for a message to travel from sender to receiver. The engineers of the ARPANET were obsessed with milliseconds, but the anomaly introduced by Project Nightingale was a delay they could not measure because it was not digital. It was psychological. The classified reports, partially erased and reconstructed, describe a state where the network was running flawlessly, yet the human operators were lagging. The hidden truth is that the ULF pressure pulse created a subtle, non-verbal suggestion of slowness, tricking the brilliant scientists into wasting weeks on trivial tasks. The great paradox of the network's foundation is that while the code was immune to interference, the human mind was not, proving that the greatest threat to digital systems is often not a bug, but a feeling. We are now focused on the intellectual battlefield of the early network, the place where physics met psychology. The documents before us include time-stamped activity reports and psychological evaluation summaries from late 1974. They show that while the objective network performance remained stable, the subjective human performance plummeted. The ink is cold and sterile,